buried this under my cabin!
Warren Cole shouted when his shovel struck something wooden beneath the old cedar tree. His gray-white German shepherd, Ash, didn't bark. He didn't dig. He simply sat beside the hole, staring at the dirt like he had been guarding that spot his whole life. Deputy Voss gave a nervous laugh and muttered,
"Old places hide old junk."
But when Warren pulled a rusted metal fragment from the soil, the deputy's smile vanished.
Don't open it!
He snapped. Too late. Warren lifted the rotted lid, and the whole yard seemed to stop breathing. Because what they found beneath that cedar had waited for years, and it was never supposed to be forgotten. Warren Cole had learned to trust quiet things. A bridge cable before it snapped, a roadbed before it gave way under a convoy, the low change in a generator's hum before the whole machine died in the cold. At 42, he carried that habit into civilian life, listening more than he spoke, fixing what others had already given up on. He had been an Army combat engineer once, the kind of man sent where roads disappeared and equipment failed at the worst possible hour. Now he drove a faded blue pickup through the back roads of northern Idaho with 2 toolboxes, a canvas duffel, and Ash sitting upright in the passenger seat like he had been assigned there by command. Warren had no large family waiting, no warm house, no proof he had landed softly after the service. He had rented rooms, slept in the truck when work ran late, and taken repair jobs from ranchers who paid in checks, coffee, or sometimes silence. Ash was the only creature who never asked him to explain why he still woke before dawn, why he hated crowded diners, or why certain sounds made his hand close around nothing. So when Warren saw the county notice for an abandoned fire watch cabin outside Briarton Ridge, he drove out to look at it before he had time to talk himself out of it. The cabin stood 12 miles beyond town, halfway up a pine-covered ridge where the road narrowed into gravel and the wind smelled of cedar, dust, and old rain. It had been built in the 1970s for fire spotters, then forgotten when newer towers went up farther west. The metal roof had rusted in long red streaks. One window was cracked from corner to corner. The radio tower behind it leaned slightly, its guide wires humming whenever the wind moved through them. The floorboards answered every step with a tired groan, and the back door stuck so badly Warren had to shoulder it open. The broker, a round-faced man named Lyle Benton, did not pretend the place was worth much. He stood near the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets and said, "Most folks take one look and drive back down the hill." Warren ran his palm along the doorframe, feeling splinters catch in the scars across his knuckles. "Most folks don't like starting from broken," he said. Lyle gave a small laugh, unsure whether Warren was joking. The county wanted $9,000. Warren paid it 3 days later, not because the cabin was cheap, but because something about its emptiness felt honest. It did not promise comfort. It promised work. That was something he understood. On the first afternoon, he parked the truck beside the porch and let Ash out. The shepherd moved slowly across the yard, nose low, crossing the grass in the pale mountain light. He sniffed the steps, the empty woodpile, the rusted barrel near the shed, then stopped under an old cedar behind the cabin. Warren watched him from the porch. Ash stood there longer than usual, ears raised, body still, staring at the thin patch of grass beneath the tree as if something below it had spoken in a language only he remembered. "What is it?" "Boy," Warren called. Ash did not bark. He only lowered his head and breathed in the soil. Warren told himself it was probably a squirrel den, or the bones of some small animal dragged in by coyotes years ago. Old places kept old smells. Still, when the evening wind came down the ridge, the radio tower gave a faint, needling whine that sounded almost like a distant call. Inside the cabin, Warren found more signs of the people who had passed through before him. a coffee mug with a cracked handle, a bent nail left in the window trim, a map of fire roads curled behind the stove. In the tool shed, beneath a collapsed shelf, he found a strip of rotten leather, dry and stiff, darkened by dirt and resin. It might have been part of a strap, maybe from an old pack or harness. He almost threw it away, then stopped. For reasons he could not name, he placed it on the workbench instead. Near sunset, as he scraped moss from the back steps, his knife caught on faint lines carved into the cabin wall. He brushed away the dust with his thumb. The words were shallow, nearly swallowed by age. But still there, he waited here. Warren read them twice. The ridge fell quiet around him. Behind the cabin, Ash had returned to the cedar and sat facing the ground, steady as a sentry, his body motionless in the last amber light. Warren looked from the words on the wall to the dog beneath the tree, and for the first time since buying the cabin, he felt that the place had not been empty at all. It had only been holding its breath. The first days at the cabin passed in the slow, stubborn rhythm Warren understood better than conversation. He changed the locks, sealed the cracked window with fresh putty, hauled out mouse-chewed insulation, and ran new wiring from the portable generator behind the shed. Each repair made the place sound a little less abandoned. The back steps no longer sagged beneath his boots. The stovepipe stopped coughing smoke into the room. The front door finally shut without needing his shoulder. Still, the cabin felt watchful, as if it revealed itself only to those willing to stay. Warren worked without music most of the time. He liked hearing the scrape of the saw, the bite of screws going into old wood, the wind sliding over the roof. Ash stayed close, never needy, never careless. He would lie where he could see Warren's hands, eyes half closed but never fully asleep. It comforted Warren in a way he did not like to admit. In the Army, a man learned the value of someone keeping watch while he fixed what had to hold. By the fourth evening, Warren had cleared enough brush from the rear of the cabin to see the slope behind it. The old cedar stood at the edge of the yard, wider than he first realized, its trunk twisted with age, its roots rising through the soil like dark knuckles. He made coffee strong enough to taste burned and sat on the porch as the light thinned across the ridge. For a while, nothing moved except the high grass and the loose wire on the radio tower, ticking softly against metal. Then Ash lifted his head. Warren noticed because the dog did not move without purpose. Ash rose from the porch, stepped down one board at a time, and crossed the yard toward the cedar. He did not bark. He did not chase anything. He lowered his nose to the ground and breathed in, slow and deep, then brushed away a thin layer of dead needles with one front paw.
"Leave it,"
Warren called, not sharply, just out of habit. Ash stopped, but he did not return. His tail hung low, his ears pointed toward the earth. Warren set his cup on the porch rail and walked down. Up close, the ground beneath the cedar looked wrong. The rest of the yard was thick with weeds and dry mountain grass. But this patch was thin, darker, slightly sunken at the center. It had the look of soil that had once been opened and closed again by careful hands. Warren crouched and pressed his fingers into it. The dirt was cool despite the day's warmth. Maybe an old burn pit, he thought. Maybe a place someone buried a box of ruined tools. Old cabins collected sad little mysteries. Then he saw the edge of something between two roots, half hidden under dirt and a film of green corrosion. He worked it loose with his pocket knife. It was a small piece of metal, round-edged, heavier than scrap, with one side worn smooth from time. Not a bottle cap, not a hinge, not a coin either. A faint mark crossed its face, but the light had faded too much to read it. Warren slipped it into his shirt pocket and stood slowly. Ash watched him, not excited, not frightened, only patient, as though Warren had finally taken the first step. and the rest would have to come in its own time. That night, the cabin seemed louder. The boards settled in the cooling air. The tower wire tapped and tapped. Somewhere in the walls, dry wood gave soft clicks like fingernails against a table. Warren washed the metal piece in a chipped enamel bowl, rubbing away dirt with his thumb until one broken line appeared, then another. 3 letters, maybe 4, carved shallow and nearly gone. Val. He stared at them under the yellow lamp. The letters meant nothing, but they did not feel like nothing. Behind him, Ash lay by the back door instead of his blanket near the stove. His body faced the cedar. Near midnight, Warren woke to a low sound, so quiet he almost mistook it for wind. Ash was dreaming, paws twitching once, throat trembling with a small mournful whine. Then the dog's eyes snapped open. He lifted his head and looked straight through the dark window toward the tree. Warren sat up on the cot, the cold metal fragment still lying on the table beside the lamp. For the first time, he wondered if he had bought the cabin because he wanted a place to begin again, or because something here had been waiting for a man with a dog to listen. By morning, Warren had decided that not every strange thing needed a story right away. Some things only needed work. Rain was due before the end of the week, and the ground behind the cabin already held water in shallow pockets where the slope leaned toward the rear wall. If he left it alone, the damp would crawl under the foundation boards and finish what years of neglect had started. So he pulled on his work gloves, marked a narrow line from the back steps toward the lower edge of the yard, and carried out a shovel, a short-handled mattock, and a coil of twine. Ash followed without being called. The shepherd moved ahead of him through the thin grass, then stopped near the cedar, as if the line Warren had marked was not the one that mattered. "Not there," Warren said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. "I'm just cutting drainage." Ash turned his head and looked at him. It was not stubbornness. Ash had the steady patience of a creature waiting for Warren to catch up. Warren stood with the shovel in his hand, feeling a small irritation rise and fade just as quickly. He had trusted that dog through bad weather, bad roads, and nights when his own thoughts had become too loud. He could trust him for one patch of earth. Warren shifted the twine a few feet closer to the cedar and began to dig. The first cut went in easy. Damp soil folded away from the blade with the dark smell of roots and rain. The second strike hit a cedar root thick as a wrist, and Warren worked around it with the mattock, careful not to scar the tree more than he had to. The third time he drove the shovel down, the sound changed. It was low and hollow, a dry wooden answer beneath the wet earth. Warren froze with both hands on the handle. He pressed again, lighter this time. The same sound came back, not the dull stop of rock, not the scrape of buried pipe, but something like metal striking old wood. Ash stepped closer and stood at the edge of the shallow trench, head lowered. Warren knelt and began clearing the soil with his hands. At first he saw only a dark line. Then a flat surface appeared, blackened by age and moisture, but still showing the grain of wood beneath the dirt. His breathing slowed without permission. He dug around it, widening the hole inch by inch, no longer thinking of rainwater or foundation boards. The buried object was longer than he expected, narrow, carefully made, and banded with rusted metal. It was too deliberate to be trash, too solemn to be a toolbox. Warren sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long time. Before he knew the facts, Warren understood he had crossed into someone else's grief. Ash placed one paw near the exposed wood but did not scratch. Then the dog lowered his head, almost as if bowing. That simple movement settled the question in Warren's mind. He would not pry it open like a scavenger. Whatever lay inside had waited long enough to be met with respect. He covered the hole with a gray tarp and weighed the corners down with stones. then went inside and called the Brierton County Sheriff's Office. The woman who answered asked if he had found human remains. Warren looked through the back window at the tarp shifting in the light wind. "I haven't opened it," he said. "It's a wooden box, old. Maybe a pet burial, maybe military. I found a metal piece nearby with letters on it." Less than an hour later, Deputy Clark Voss arrived in a dust-covered county cruiser. He was a lean man in his 50s with tired eyes and a voice careful enough not to insult the living or the dead. At first, he studied the exposed box and nodded as if he had seen things like it before. "Could be somebody's old dog," he said. "Folks used to bury them close to home." Warren handed him the cleaned metal fragment. Clark turned it over in his palm. When he saw the faint letters, Val, something shifted in his face. He looked past Warren, toward the cedar, then toward the cabin, as though the ridge had suddenly remembered a name he had tried to place for years. "There was a man up here once," Clark said slowly. "Nolan Greer, old veteran, kept to himself, always had a big dog with him. People in town used to say that dog followed him like a shadow." He paused, closing his fingers around the metal. "Then one summer, nobody saw the dog again. The wind moved through the cedar branches, and the tarp rose and fell over the long box as if the ground beneath it had finally taken its first breath in decades." Deputy Clark Voss did not reach for his radio right away. He stood beside the shallow hole with his hat in one hand and the small metal fragment in the other, looking at the box as if it had changed shape without moving. Warren knew that look. It was the look men wore when procedure was not enough, when a thing in front of them belonged partly to the law and partly to the heart. Clark said there was no sign of a human burial, no disturbed crime scene, no reason yet to bring half the county up the ridge, but he also did not speak of the box as junk. He asked Warren to record the opening on his phone, slow and clear, in case anyone later needed to know exactly how it had been found. Warren set the phone against a stone, checked the frame, then knelt with a small pry bar. Ash sat close to his left side, still as carved wood, his chest rising and falling in quiet breaths. The first pull did nothing. The second made the rusted nails complain. On the third, the lid gave with a long, dry groan that seemed to pass through the cedar roots and into the morning air. Warren stopped for a moment, his fingers tight around the bar. He had opened jammed crates, burned out panels, wrecked engine covers, even sealed ammunition cases overseas. But this felt different. This was not being opened because it had failed. It was being opened because someone had waited too long to be known. Inside lay a folded piece of canvas, stiff with age but arranged with care. Warren touched it with 2 fingers, then looked to Clark. The deputy nodded once. Warren lifted the edge slowly. Beneath it was the skeleton of a large dog, curled slightly as if sleep had been made permanent. The long muzzle rested near one side of the box, the bones still arranged with a strange, gentle dignity. Around the neck clung the remains of a leather collar, cracked nearly through, and from it hung 2 small tags fused together by rust and soil. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The fear Warren had carried without naming it loosened inside his chest, but what replaced it was heavier. Reverence came first, then grief, then a tenderness so sudden he had to swallow before it showed on his face. This animal had not been discarded. It had been laid down. Someone had folded the canvas around him and closed the lid, knowing his paws would never cross the cabin floor again. Warren reached in carefully, unhooked the tags, and cleaned them with the corner of his handkerchief. The letters appeared reluctantly, as though pulled from deep water. K9 Valor. Partner of Staff, Sergeant Nolan Greer. Clark exhaled through his nose and looked toward the tree line. "My father used to mention that name," he said. "Greer. He called him the man on the mountain who never left his dog, or maybe the dog never left him. I was young. I thought it was just one of those stories old men tell when the weather turns. Warren held the tags in his palm. They were cold, but the names seemed to carry warmth. Beneath the canvas, near the dog's shoulder, he noticed something flat and brittle. He eased it out and found half of an old photograph, its edges browned, the image faded almost to smoke. A young soldier stood in dusty fatigues, with one hand resting on the head of a German shepherd. The man's face was torn away by time, but the hand remained clear, broad and protective. Fingers sunk gently into the dog's fur. Warren looked at Ash. Ash looked back at him, then lowered his head toward the open box. Not sniffing now, not searching, only bowing in a silence Warren understood better than words. In that moment, the ridge no longer felt empty, and the cedar no longer felt like just a tree. It felt like a witness. The box before them was not a mystery anymore. Not exactly. It was a meeting that had come decades late. One veteran kneeling beside another veteran's grief. One loyal dog standing over the bones of another, and a forgotten name beginning at last to rise out of the earth. After Deputy Clark Voss left the ridge, the cabin seemed to settle into a different kind of quiet. Warren had covered the box again, not with the careless motion of a man hiding a problem, but with the slow care of someone closing a door to a room where grief still sat upright. The tags lay on his kitchen table beside the metal fragment, both cleaned as gently as he knew how, both catching the lamplight in dull, tired flashes. K9 Valor, partner of staff, Sergeant Nolan Greer. The words had weight. They made the cabin feel less like a purchase and more like a responsibility that had been passed to him without warning. Ash lay beneath the table with his head between his paws, facing the back door. He had not eaten much. He had not begged for the piece of toast Warren dropped by accident. He only watched, quiet and steady, as if waiting for Warren to understand that finding the box was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. Outside, the ridge had gone black. Wind moved through the cracks in the back wall and touched the lamp flame until the shadows trembled. The loose wire on the radio tower struck metal in small, patient taps. Warren opened his old laptop, the one with a cracked corner and a battery that no longer held a charge, and typed Nolan Greer into the county records search. At first, the past gave him almost nothing. A property occupancy form from 2006. A tax notice forwarded twice, then marked undeliverable. Finally, a death notice from 2000 long. Nolan Avery Greer, age 59, passed away at his residence outside Briarton Ridge. No services listed, no surviving relatives named, no photograph, no story. Warren stared at the screen until the words blurred slightly. A man had lived, served, grown old, and vanished from the public record with less space than a used truck ad. He leaned back and rubbed his thumb across one of the tags. He had known men like that. Men who returned home with too much silence inside them and found that the world preferred them easy to thank, easy to forget, and easy to file away. He searched deeper, moving from county records to old local newspapers, then to scanned veteran newsletters and broken archive links that loaded one line at a time. Near midnight, he found a small article from 1992 in the Briarton Ridge Sentinel, buried beneath a weather report and a photograph of flood damage near the Snake River. The headline was plain enough to be missed. Local soldier returns after overseas service. Beneath it was a grainy picture of a younger Nolan Greer in uniform, his face lean, his eyes tired even then, one hand resting on the head of a large German shepherd. Valor stood pressed close to him, alert and proud. As if the dog had understood, the camera was less important than the man beside him. The article said Staff Sergeant Greer had served with a K-9 unit, trained in mine detection and post-blast search. It mentioned a route outside a damaged village, a dirt track thought to be clear, and a dog that stopped before the patrol walked into a line of hidden explosives. 12 men, the article said, reached home because Valor refused to move forward. Warren read that sentence 3 times. He knew what a few seconds could mean. He had seen whole futures balanced on the warning of a machine, the instinct of a dog, the smallest change in dust on a road. He searched for Valor after that, but the trail thinned. The dog appeared in a unit note, then a transfer summary, then a recommendation for commendation that had never been completed. Missing final signature, the record said. Returned pending verification after office relocation. Another note, dated years later, showed Nolan Greer had written twice asking for the file to be reopened. No final response attached. Warren sat very still. Ash lifted his head, sensing the change in him. He tried, Warren said softly, though he was not sure whether he meant Nolan or Valor, or every quiet man who had ever carried proof of love to a desk where no one looked up. Long enough. Dawn had begun to pale behind the cedar when Warren finally closed the laptop. The box under the tree was no longer just a grave. It was an unfinished sentence, and somehow it had waited until a tired veteran, a watchful dog, and a forgotten cabin were all in the same place to be read again. Warren drove down to Briarton Ridge the next morning with Ash in the passenger seat, and the name Nolan Greer folded into his thoughts like a note he could not put away. The town sat in a shallow valley below the ridge, small enough that a man could see nearly all of it from the gas station at the north end. One diner with a sun-faded sign, a brick post office, a closed shoe repair shop with dust on the window, a feed store, and an old veterans' hall that looked as though it opened only when someone remembered where the key was kept. Warren parked near the diner and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. He had faced harder things than questions, but asking strangers to remember a forgotten man felt strangely intimate, almost like knocking on doors inside someone else's memory. Ash watched the sidewalk through the windshield, calm but alert. Inside the diner, the waitress knew the name only after Warren repeated it. "Greer," she said, pouring coffee into a mug that had already gone cold once. "The man up by the fire cabin?" She frowned with the effort of reaching backward. "Quiet fellow, didn't talk much. Came in sometimes years ago. Sat near the window, paid cash, that was all." At the post office, an older clerk remembered forwarding mail to the Ridge, then having it come back after Nolan died. At the feed store, a man behind the counter said Nolan had bought rope, lamp oil, and dog food in large bags, always polite, never lingering. No one spoke with cruelty. That almost made it worse. Their answers were clean, brief, harmless, and empty. Warren began to understand that Nolan had not been hated in Briarton Ridge. He had simply stood at the edge of everyone's life until time made him part of the scenery. People remembered the shape of him, not the weight he carried. They remembered the dog, but not the devotion. By noon, Warren found the old gas station at the foot of the mountain, its pumps long removed, its office converted into a small shop that sold maps, used books, and coffee from a silver percolator. The woman behind the counter was thin, white-haired, and sharp-eyed, with a name tag that read Mabel Rourke. When Warren asked about Nolan, she did not need time to search for the name. She looked past him through the window toward the ridge, and her face softened in a way that made Warren stand a little stiller. "Nolan Greer," she said. "He used to come in every second Thursday. 2 cans of motor oil, 1 tin of coffee, sometimes beans, always dog food. Never asked for credit. Never complained about the price." Warren asked if she remembered Valor. Mabel's hand paused on the counter. That dog stood so close to him you'd think they shared one shadow. She smiled faintly, but the smile did not last. Big shepherd, steady eyes. Never once barked in here. Nolan would tell him to wait, and that dog would wait, like the whole world had gone quiet around him. She came around the counter slowly and lowered herself into a wooden chair. Warren did not rush her. He had learned that memory, like old machinery, could break if forced. Mabel looked at Ash, who had settled near Warren's boot. "We thought Nolan wanted to be left alone," she said. "That's what people tell themselves when a man makes them uncomfortable." He was polite, but he had a distance around him, like a fence no one could see. Her fingers tightened on the edge of her sweater. "Back then, I figured respect meant not crossing it. Now I wonder if we were just too impatient to care the right way." The sentence landed quietly, but Warren felt it. He thought of the short death notice, the unanswered letters, the box beneath the cedar. A town did not have to be cruel to forget a man. Sometimes it only had to keep moving. Mabel rose after a moment and went to a drawer beneath the register. From inside, she took a small envelope yellowed at the edges. "He left this with me the last winter I saw him," she said. "Told me if anyone ever came asking about Valor, I should hand it over." Warren opened the envelope and found an old brass key, dark with age, hanging from a cracked leather tag. One word had been burned into the leather by hand: Valor. Ash lifted his head as if he had heard the name spoken from somewhere farther away than the room. Warren closed his fingers around the key, and for the first time since he had found the box, the mystery no longer felt buried beneath the cedar. It felt locked somewhere inside the cabin, waiting for the door to open. Warren reached the cabin just as the last light was leaving the ridge, the sky fading from copper to a cold blue that made the cedar trunks look almost black. Ash jumped down from the truck before Warren could open his own door, circled once, and went straight to the back of the cabin. Warren stood for a moment with the brass key in his palm, feeling its old weight settle into him. He had tried not to expect too much on the drive up. Old keys often opened nothing. Old stories often ended in dust. Still, the leather tag carried one word: Valor, and Warren could not shake the feeling that it belonged there. Warren checked the front door first, then the shed lock, then the rusted cabinet near the stove. Nothing. The key slid in halfway or not at all. He tried the old trunk under the cot, the storage box by the window, and the padlock on a bent tool chest. Each failed turn made the cabin feel smaller, dimmer, as though it were closing around the secret instead of giving it up. Ash moved differently that evening. He did not pace. He searched. Nose low, ears forward, he passed through the main room, crossed into the narrow tool alcove behind the kitchen wall, and stopped before a stack of old paint cans and rotted sandbags. Warren almost called him away, then saw Ash press his muzzle against a loose plank behind them. The board shifted with a dry scrape. Warren pulled the cans aside, dragged the sandbags out one by one, and found a low wooden door hidden behind them, no higher than his chest, its hinges painted over, its lock dark with age. The key entered cleanly. Warren's hand tightened before he turned it. The lock gave with a soft click that sounded too small for the years it had held shut. The room beyond had no window. It was not frightening, not cluttered, not the kind of place a man used to hide shame. It felt more like a chapel built by someone who did not believe he deserved one. A narrow table stood against the wall. An oil lamp sat beside a broken radio, 2 folded maps, a canteen, and a black notebook wrapped in oilcloth. An old military footlocker rested in the corner, its green paint scraped pale along the edges. Dust covered everything except the table, where the air seemed oddly still. Warren unwrapped the notebook and opened it beneath the beam of his flashlight. Nolan Greer's handwriting was straight, spare, and controlled. He wrote about the roof leaking near the stove, snow blocking the road, and the radio he could never quite fix. He wrote about nights when Valor would not sleep, and about starting toward town before turning back at the first-mile marker. The entries did not beg for pity. That made them harder to read. They belonged to a man trying to stay useful, trying to stay decent, trying not to become a burden anyone else had to name. Warren turned a page and stopped. "If someone finds this place after I am gone, please do not call Valor my dog. He was the one who brought me home when I no longer knew where home was." Warren read it again, slower. Behind him, Ash sat in the doorway, his head lowered, but his eyes fixed on Warren. The words reached a place Warren usually kept locked, tighter than any hidden room. He thought of the months after leaving the service, when ordinary streets had felt too open and quiet rooms too loud, when Ash had leaned against his leg without asking anything from him except that he stay. Warren turned more pages. Nolan wrote of a blast, of waking in dust with no sense of direction, of Valor barking somewhere beyond the smoke until Nolan crawled toward the sound. He wrote that the dog had saved the unit once, then saved him again in the long war that came afterward. At the back of the notebook, folded between two blank pages, Warren found an unsigned request form for the county memorial. The line for Nolan's name had been crossed out. Beside it, in the same careful handwriting, was one sentence: "I do not need mine remembered, just his." Warren sat in that hidden room until the flashlight began to dim, feeling the cabin breathe around him, feeling the past not as a ghost, but as a hand placed gently on his shoulder. The footlocker waited in the corner, still closed. Warren waited until morning to open the footlocker. He could have done it that night, with a dying flashlight and Ash breathing softly in the doorway, but something in him refused. A few more hours would not harm it. At dawn, pale light slipped through the cracks in the cabin wall and touched the dust in thin silver lines. And Warren carried the old military footlocker to the main room where the air felt less buried. Ash followed close, not restless now, only solemn, as though he too understood that whatever waited inside deserved daylight. The latches were stiff, but they gave after Warren worked oil into them and eased them loose with the flat edge of his knife. When the lid opened, there was no smell of money, no hidden weapon, no dramatic treasure, only paper, cloth, leather, and memory, preserved by a man who had expected no one to care and still hoped someone might. On top lay a full photograph, clearer than the torn half from the box. Nolan Greer stood beside a dusty military vehicle, younger, but already carrying that faraway look Warren had seen in men who returned before the war was finished with them. Beside him stood Valor, a large German shepherd with steady eyes and one ear slightly bent at the tip. Nolan's hand rested on the dog's neck, not posing, not commanding, simply touching, as if to make sure the world had not taken him too. Beneath the photo was a spare collar, dark leather polished smooth from use, 3 folded letters, an old mission map, a unit patch, and an unsealed envelope addressed to the Briarton County Veterans Office. Warren opened the letters first. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but the handwriting remained strong enough to cross the years. One soldier wrote that Valor had stopped dead before a dirt road everyone believed was safe, refusing to move even when ordered forward, and minutes later the team found a line of hidden explosives beneath the surface. Another wrote of smoke, broken radios, and Valor circling back after a blast, barking until rescuers found Nolan alive under a sheet of dust and splintered wood. The third letter was the shortest. Warren read it once, then sat down because his knees had gone strangely weak. "I have a house, a wife, a morning coffee cup, and ordinary days because that dog did not leave us behind. Please make sure somebody says his name right." Warren set the letter on the table and pressed his fingers lightly against it, careful not to damage the crease. He did not need proof anymore. He had the box under the cedar, the tags, the notebook, the photograph, the letters, and the ache in his own chest that told him the truth. But the world had always demanded proof from people like Nolan. And sometimes even proof was not enough, unless someone living carried it to the right door. Warren spent the next hours photographing every item, scanning what he could, and calling offices that passed him from one extension to another. The County Veterans Hall asked for copies. The Idaho State Police K-9 unit said they would review the material. A small military history museum in Boise replied with careful interest. Not warmth exactly, but enough to keep Warren moving. Nobody promised anything. They used words like verification, archive request, chain of custody, possible review. Once. Those words might have made Warren set the phone down and walk away. This time, he did not. Respect, he was beginning to understand, was not a feeling that rose in a man during a moving story. It was paperwork, patience, repetition, the willingness to keep speaking a forgotten name until the room stopped treating it like dust. Late that afternoon, a K-9 officer named Sergeant Daniel Price called from Boise. His voice changed when Warren said Valor's name. "My first handler instructor told a story about a shepherd named Valor," he said slowly. "No official file, just something passed down. That dog saved a team, then disappeared from the record. We thought it was half legend." Warren looked toward Ash, who had lifted his head at the name. "He wasn't a legend," Warren said. "He was real. And he was under that cedar." The next call came from the county clerk near closing time. An old meeting record had surfaced in a storage scan. Nolan Greer had once been invited to a small veterans recognition ceremony, but the notice had been mailed to his previous address after he moved up to the cabin. It had come back undelivered. Warren stood by the table long after the call ended, the letters spread before him, the cabin quiet around him. Nolan had not refused to be remembered. The invitation had simply never found him. Outside, the cedar moved in the wind, and for the first time the sound did not feel heavy. It felt like an answer beginning to arrive. The ceremony was held on a gray morning when the fog still lay low over the Brierton County Veterans Cemetery, softening the white stones until they seemed to rise out of the earth like quiet witnesses. There was no platform, no television crew, no line of curious strangers waiting to turn grief into spectacle. Only a row of folding chairs on damp grass, a few small American flags, the county veterans director, Deputy Clark Voss, Sergeant Daniel Price, with 2 K-9 handlers, Mabel, Rourke, and Warren standing near the back with Ash. He had dressed in his cleanest denim shirt and the old field jacket he wore when he did not know what else to put on for something important. Ash sat close to his left leg, eyes fixed on the small wooden box placed beneath the canopy. Valor's remains had been moved there with care, resting now in a new wooden casket covered with deep blue cloth. Beside it stood a table holding the old collar, the cleaned metal tags, the photograph of Nolan Greer with his hand on Valor's neck, and the black notebook Warren had found in the hidden room. Nolan had no close relatives to stand for him. That absence might have made the morning feel empty, but somehow it did not. Every person there seemed to understand that they had arrived not as guests, but as late witnesses. When the county veterans director spoke, he did not use grand words. He read Nolan's full name, Staff Sergeant Nolan Avery Greer, slowly enough that it seemed to settle into the fog. Then he read Valor's name, not as an animal listed beneath a man, but as K-9 Valor, partner, protector, loyal friend. Warren saw Mabel lower her eyes. He saw Clark remove his hat and hold it against his chest. The wind passed through the cemetery pines. With the same patient sound, Warren had heard beneath the cedar at the cabin, and for a moment the two places felt connected by an invisible road. Sergeant Price stepped forward next and spoke about K-9 teams, about the trust that forms when a handler and dog learn to move as one life with two bodies. His voice remained steady until he reached the part about Valor, stopping before the dirt road that should have killed Nolan's team. Then he paused, looked down at the casket, and said, "Some names survive in paperwork. Some survive because one person tells another, and that person tells another, until the truth waits for a place to land. Today this name lands here." Warren had not expected to speak. He had hoped to remain behind Ash, behind the handlers, behind the men who knew how ceremonies were supposed to work. But when the director turned and quietly asked if he would say a few words, Warren felt the old instinct to refuse rise in him, then fade. He walked to the front with Ash following without command. For a few seconds, he looked at the photograph on the table. Nolan's face was younger there, but his eyes carried the same distance Warren had seen in mirrors. Warren placed one hand lightly on Ash's head. "I did not find Valor because I was looking for history," he said. "I was trying to keep rainwater out of an old cabin. Ash found the place beneath the cedar, and I was smart enough, just barely, to listen." A few people smiled softly, but no one laughed. Warren continued, his voice low. "I think some people come home from war and do not know how to ask for help. I think some people become quiet, not because they need nothing, but because they have learned not to trouble anyone with what they carry. And sometimes a dog understands that before the rest of us do." He looked toward Mabel, then Clark, then the casket. "Respect should not begin only after we learn someone was brave. It should begin when they are still just a quiet person at a diner window, or a man buying oil at a gas station, or a neighbor no one knows how to talk to." Nolan Greer should have heard his friend's name spoken like this while he was alive. We cannot give him that morning back, but we can give him this one. Mabel covered her mouth with a gloved hand. After the final prayer, she stepped forward and placed the old brass key beside Nolan's photograph. The leather tag marked Valor facing upward. Clark removed his hat again. One of the state police German shepherds was guided to the casket and sat perfectly still. Ash rose beside Warren. For one breath, the two dogs faced the blue cloth and the photograph together, then lowered their heads. Nothing supernatural happened. No sign split the sky. No voice came through the fog. Yet the silence that followed felt deep enough to hold every missing year afterward. The county director told Warren that Nolan and Valor's names would be added to the local K-9 memorial, not as a favor, but as a debt finally recognized. Then Sergeant Price handed Warren a careful copy of Nolan's black notebook. "You should keep this," he said. "You understood what it was before the rest of us did." Warren accepted it with both hands. On the drive back up the ridge, Ash slept with his head against the seat, and Warren felt for the first time that the road to the cabin no longer led away from the world. It led back to something that had been waiting to be honored. After the ceremony, Warren drove back up the ridge with Nolan's notebook on the seat between him and Ash. The road was the same narrow strip of gravel it had been the first day. Bending through pine shade and climbing toward the old Firewatch cabin, yet it no longer felt like a road leaving town. It felt like a road returning something. By the time he reached the cabin, the afternoon light had turned soft and gold. The radio tower still leaned behind the shed. The floorboards still complained under his boots. The back door still caught at the bottom and needed a careful lift before it would close. The cedar still stood behind the cabin with its roots sunk deep into the dark soil, holding the shape of all it had guarded. Nothing had changed enough for a stranger to notice, but Warren noticed. The air around the cabin felt lighter now, like a home slowly learning how to rest. He did not turn the cabin into a shrine. He did not call the newspaper, hang banners, or put the story on a sign by the road. He had seen how easily respect could become performance when too many people gathered around it. Instead, he ordered a small bronze plaque from a shop in Boise and set it beneath the cedar, low enough that a person had to step close and bow slightly to read it. Here waited K9 Valor, loyal friend of staff Sergeant Nolan Greer. Beneath the plaque, Warren planted wild lupine, yarrow, and mountain bluebells. They were not showy flowers. They did not bloom all at once or demand attention from the road. They held to the soil, came back after cold nights, and bent without breaking when the ridge wind moved through them. Ash seemed to approve. Each evening, after Warren finished work, Ash walked to the cedar and lay in the patch of shade where the box had been found. Warren built him a small shelter nearby, but Ash rarely used it unless rain came hard. Most days he preferred the ground itself, as though some duty had passed from one dog to another in a language older than command. Summer eased in slowly. Word of the ceremony traveled through the county, not loudly but steadily. A retired lineman came first with a generator that would not turn over. Then a former Marine brought a chainsaw and stayed 2 hours after it was fixed, drinking black coffee on the porch without saying much. Warren learned not to fill the quiet. He did not ask what they had seen, what they had lost, or why their hands sometimes shook when the wind hit the radio tower just right. He fixed what they brought. He poured coffee. He let silence be silence, without treating it like a problem. Once a month he wrote on a sheet of paper and pinned it inside the workshop door. Valor Day, bring what's broken. At first he meant engines, pumps, radios, and saws. Over time he understood the words had widened without his permission. Men came with machines, but sometimes they also brought the parts of themselves no manual could name. Warren could not repair all of that. He knew better than to pretend, but he could offer a chair, a cup, a place where no one hurried them back into being easy for the world to understand. Late that fall, on a night clear enough to show every star above the ridge, Warren sat on the porch with Nolan's notebook open on his lap. Ash rested at his feet, silver fur glowing faintly in the moonlight. The wind moved through the cedar with a softer voice than it had used in those first uneasy nights. Warren turned to the line he had read so many times the page had begun to feel familiar under his thumb. He was the one who brought me home when I no longer knew where home was. Warren rested one hand on Ash's head. Only then did Warren understand why the cabin had felt broken in a way tools could not fix. It was in the letters never answered, the quiet men no one had learned how to ask about, and the way a person could be useful, polite, and still disappear. Before going inside, Warren looked toward the cedar. "Rest easy, Valor," he said softly. "He's remembered now." Ash lifted his head as the branches stirred. The sound that came from the tree was only wind, probably just cedar needles brushing together in the dark. Warren did not try to make it more than that. He smiled, turned off the porch light, and stepped into the cabin. For the first time in many years, the old place did not feel abandoned. It felt like a home. If Warren and Ash's story stayed with you, please like this video and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, courage, and forgotten heroes. Share in the comments which moment touched you most, and tell us where you're watching from.